Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to ACT Shelter's online forum on missing middle housing, the equity and affordability implications of reforms. It's terrific to see such a strong interest in today's discussion. We've had well over 100 registrations. No doubt people will be continuing to join us, but we'll make a start now, knowing that we have got a full discussion ahead of us and a lot of different areas of missing middle housing to traverse. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal, Ngambri and the Ngarigo peoples as the traditional custodians of the Canberra region from which I'm joining you today. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, acknowledge their continuing custodianship of this land and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I also warmly welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us today. And to our colleagues joining us from other states and territories, I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands which you are joining us from. So today's topic is certainly very timely, and it's one that has been a focus of debate and discussion here in the ACT and also in other jurisdictions. We are facing, as often noted, a housing affordability crisis, and across Australia, governments are wrestling with how to increase housing supply and ensure more people can access secure, affordable housing. One policy response that has gained significant momentum here in the ACT and in other jurisdictions is reforming planning systems to enable more so-called missing middle housing. So more medium density housing, particularly in established suburbs, and the type of housing that sits between low density detached homes and high-rise apartments. Reforms aimed at facilitating missing middle housing often involve upzoning, increasing allowable density in established areas alongside changes to approval pathways and development controls. As the peak body for housing justice in the ACT Shelter is particularly concerned about the equity and affordability implications of these reforms. We're interested in interrogating some of the assumptions that are often brought into this policy debate, as well as thinking constructively about what measures and mechanisms should be implemented to ensure more equitable housing outcomes. So some of the key questions that we might consider today is, will upzoning translate into genuinely more affordable homes? What are the distributional impacts of zoning and value uplift? How do tax settings interact with supply? And critically, how can reforms support the delivery of more social and affordable housing and not just additional dwellings? These are complex questions and they deserve careful evidence-based discussion. We've assembled an exceptional panel today to help us delve into some of these issues and explore the implications of proposed reforms. So for the first part of today's session, each of our presenters will provide a presentation or some opening remarks. And just so that we can get through all the speakers and make sure we have some time at the end to have a panel discussion, we'll allow up to 5 minutes of audience questions after each presentation. And questions that we don't reach after each speaker will carry over into the moderated panel discussion in the second half of the session. So just the format, I've just said the format, but just so you know, I might be getting a little bit of echo there. Sorry. So just if you do want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. You can also, you're welcome to post questions also in the chat. My colleague Deb Pippin from ACT Shelter will be monitoring the chat and feeding some of the questions through when we go to the panel discussion and to the Q&A at the end of each speaker. And we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible, but we'll see how we go. So I don't want to talk any further. I think we'll go to our first speaker, who is James Bennett, Executive Branch Manager of the Building, Design and Development Branch within the ACT Government City and Environment Directorate. James leads policy development relating to urban design, the Territory Plan, and building performance and is overseeing major reform projects, including the missing middle housing reforms and the sustainable buildings pathway. He's also the ACT's representative on the Australian Building Codes Board and has a background in environmental and property law. James, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Corinne, and thank you for having me along today to talk to you about the reforms. I'm just going to bring up some slides, and we'll just talk to these generally, noting that we've got a lot to get through today. I'll give a brief overview of the reforms and happy to take any more detailed questions as we go forward, and very happy to share these slides so you don't have to write down every word that's on them if you're interested in the content. So as Corinne mentioned, we've been progressing the missing middle housing reforms as one of government's response to providing more housing supply across the ACT and addressing that future demand that we have for housing as we expect population to grow throughout the city. So the context for our reform is looking to not only housing supply challenges now, but also the expected population growth in the future. And on our population estimates, by 2050, we expect nearly 700,000 people to call our city home. And the ACT government has a commitment to enable 30,000 new homes across Canberra in the next 5 years. The missing middle housing reforms as part of that program are really about supporting more housing choice, having that housing choice be available in new and existing suburbs across the ACT, recognising that we have a limited amount of available land left for new greenfield development, and looking to make better use of our existing suburbs and limit urban sprawl, and planning for a more compact, efficient and sustainable Canberra by looking at these opportunities for sensitive infill development to occur across the city. And so a big point here is that the missing middle housing reforms open capacity and flexibility within our planning system as it applies to our residential areas to meet that current and future demand for new housing. For the missing middle housing reforms, we're talking about that lower end of the sort of medium density scale. So we're talking dual and tri-occupancies, terraces and townhouses, and low-rise apartments up to 3 stories. That's been the focus of the current reform program that we're talking about. The major reform elements that we have put forward here are a missing middle housing design guide, and also complementary changes to the territory plan, which are seeking to remove barriers in the planning system that stop this type of housing being able to be built within our existing residential areas, and really supporting well-designed, sustainable homes that are built well, designed well, and in accordance with that best practice design guide, to really strengthen the design outcomes that we're getting, so that we have functional, well-designed and very livable homes. I will just touch on a couple of the key elements of the reform proposal, but I don't want to go into too much detail here, noting the time. One of the big changes here is tweaks that we've made to the policy outcomes for the RZ1, our sort of low density suburban zone, and our RZ2 zones, which have that slightly higher density aspect to it. We have tweaked the policy outcomes for those zones to talk about enabling change to occur within our suburbs whilst respecting neighbourhood and landscape character. So it's been a really important part of this reform. We know that the Canberra that we know and love is important to so many people who live in this city, but also we need to cater for future housing demand, and we need to cater for those people who currently don't have a home to live in, and try and find that balance to enable change to occur within our existing suburbs. We have a range of policy tweaks that are aimed at increasing density through allowing more dwellings to be built on existing residential blocks, but also limiting the overall site coverage that can be built on. So there's some key restrictions on how much of the block can be built on, so that we're finding that balance between more dwellings, but also protecting our planting areas, our open space on site, so that people have that really nice livable dwelling, and the environmental aspects of that as well. Another aspect of this is to open up opportunities for different housing models and different housing styles. And one of the things that we've done is remove a restriction on co-housing. What we've sought here is to allow people to build the different built forms of new housing, but then be really open and flexible to different housing models that people may choose to live in to suit their different needs, and offering a more affordable entry point for different housing models. The other thing I just want to mention here is that we have opened up opportunities for block subdivision and consolidation of blocks to allow greater flexibility, to allow potentially large residential blocks to be subdivided into smaller parcels to create that opportunity for more houses, and also to permit consolidation where there's an opportunity to bring multiple blocks together to form a more integrated and consolidated development. Just want to touch on how policy design and implementation can deliver equitable housing and some of the key principles that we've been working through here. As I mentioned earlier, a big part of this reform is about housing choice and allowing greater housing diversity across the residential areas in the ACT. And this is to say that people at the moment are restricted from having that housing choice based on the planning rules. And this will really open up that opportunity, within the system for the market to respond and provide housing that meets the different needs of the Canberra community and responding to demands in different parts of the market. We've also looked at changes to density to allow smaller, more efficient land use, potentially lowering some of the price points of new housing. We've looked at the location and access elements of the reforms as well, and really pushing for new housing in well-located areas close to where people live, work, close to services and facilities, to improve the sort of livability of people's lives and make sure that people have that opportunity to live close to where they need to and where they live their lives. And access has been a really important part about the design-led process, about how our new development and land within established suburbs integrates within the context, and how a new development will interact with the surrounding public spaces, the pedestrian network, the open space network, and the public transport network, to make sure that we have good design principles that are supporting these new developments. Also, elements around amenity, living infrastructure and sustainability have been really important principles that we've sought to deliver through the reform program as well. As we move forward and the reforms are considered by the Legislative Assembly and hopefully approved in the coming months, we will move into the implementation phase, where we're also looking at developing a Canberra House pattern book. We're looking at running a design competition here, where we will develop a pattern book of missing middle housing designs that will offer a streamlined approval pathway. And this will provide the community with cost-effective access to high-quality designs that meet the planning rules that we are putting forward. And these pattern book designs will have options for different types of housing outcomes, including the price range, dwelling sizes, and accessibility and adaptability will be fundamental aspects of the pattern book process. We'll be looking at opportunities to demonstrate the pattern book dwellings through construction, and also we'll be undertaking evaluation of this policy process to make sure that we've achieved the outcomes that we've set out to do. Just want to touch on the next steps of the work. As Corinne mentioned, we've had the Assembly inquiry on this week. The government appeared before that with the Minister yesterday, and now the committee will go away and finish their report. We're expecting that report by April. Following that, the government will consider any recommendations. We'll then finalise the planning changes and bring them back to the Assembly for approval. And there's a period of time where the Assembly can consider those final reforms before they can commence. At the same time as those reforms are being finalised and approved, we will be finalising the Missing Middle Housing Design Guide, and also then looking at those future work programs around the pattern book and how we can have streamlined approval pathways that bring new housing on quicker and allow people the opportunity to move into these new dwellings. That is everything that I wanted to cover off from a context perspective. So happy to hand back to you, Corinne.
Thanks very much, James. So I'll just now go, does anyone have any questions that they wanted to ask James about his presentation and what's been proposed here in the ACT? Anna, I can see you've got your hand up. Go for it, Anna, if you're there, if you wanted to.
Sorry. I happen to live. I've got the same echo.
I can hear there's an echo in your delivery, and I know I did see on the line. I'm not sure what it is, Anna, because I didn't get the echo. I think others aren't getting the echo, so I don't know if there's anything that you're able to do from your end. I do apologise about that.
I'll send in a comment.
Okay, if you pop your question in perhaps you pop it in the chat. Hopefully we can get to that. I might just, while you're doing that, I might just go, I noticed the next question was from, sorry, let me see, Ed.
Yeah, just a quick, hi, Corinne. Just a quick question for Jeff, for James rather. Possibilities for land assembly at the small scale for adjoining owners. And the other question is around the standards for minimum open space.
Yeah, thank you. So on the land assembly, that is absolutely something that we have opened up some flexibility on that in the RZ1 zone. So that's currently prohibited in the RZ1 zone, and we have opened up the opportunity for what we're calling block consolidation, where we have blocks that are adjacent to each other that could be brought forward together. We do know that increasing the parcel of land allows greater opportunities for design and resolving some of the constraints on the land, and also sort of integrating into the broader streetscape and the sort of path and access network. So we have opened up those opportunities here, and that is something that we'll be leaving to the private market to identify those opportunities, partner with builders and developers to seek to find those opportunities where they are available and viable and make sense. On the open space requirements, we have made some tweaks to the open space requirements, and what we are working through our design process. We've got a range of urban design architecture expertise within our team. We've engaged some consultants to support that work. We've also worked with the local design and architecture profession as well, to find the right balance between denser housing, but also making sure that we have good amenity and livability on the block. So by having some more housing on there's a need to sort of have increased driveway space and services, but also we've been really careful to retain good, meaningful open space on the block for planting areas, but also for that private open space for residents to live in as well.
Thank you. Libby, you've got your hands up. Do you have a question you wanted to ask? Let me just see. Libby, did you have a question that you wanted to ask James? Got your hand up. If not, just while we're just seeing if Libby's able to take the mic off, I might just ask James, with you mentioned block consolidation and some other things there. I just wondered how much some of these options that you're looking at might be able to facilitate potentially more social and affordable housing, or what mechanisms the government's thinking about to do that, knowing that our concern is we are seeing that decline overall in the proportion of social housing, particularly in the ACT. And so one of the things that we're looking at with Missing Middle is how is it going to help with, there's the overall affordability issue, but also thinking about how we get some of those particular housing types for those who are really locked out of the private market.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess the first thing which I won't talk to in too much detail because it's not in my policy area, but the Minister for Housing, Minister Berry, talked about it yesterday, that government has a particular set of housing targets around public housing and growing the public housing portfolio. Complementary to that, these opportunities for denser housing will be available to all lessees, including the ACT government's public housing program. So there's some good opportunities that not just private lessees will be able to benefit from this, but also opportunities for the public housing program to explore for infill developments. And I'd also just sort of make the point that this reform is complemented by a range of other sort of supports and interventions. And just last week, the government made a significant announcement about reducing lease variation charges for community housing providers to help deliver social and affordable rentals. And that is a significant investment by government to reduce that lease variation charge cost, to open up opportunities for CHPs to make viability work, and then really broaden that social and affordable rental offering. So that's a significant announcement and program to try and support the uptake of new housing too.
Thank you. So I'll just go, as I said, it's just a short time for questions, just so we can move through the speakers, but I will just go to 2 more questions. So I just noticed Libby, who did have a hand up before, just asked the question, when will the competition for the Canberra House pattern book commence?
We are looking to commence the pattern book competition after the reforms pass the Assembly. So we want to run the pattern book competition based on whatever the final form of the reforms are that pass the Assembly. So that's likely to be, we're hoping that the reforms will go to the Assembly in around the mid-year, and then there'll be some period of time for the Assembly to consider them. So second half of this year, potentially early next year, when that design competition is happening.
And I'll just go to the final question. I know, David, you've got your hand up. So just so, as I said, we move along, but please do, we will have a session towards the end to ask questions. And also, if you wanted to pop your question into the chat function, we'll see if we can get to it, around to it. And also there's a question I noticed in the chat about the lease variation charge, which we certainly will get to talk a bit more in this session about the lease variation charge. So there might also be an opportunity to delve into that further then. I'll just go to Lynette and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So Lynette, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yes, I'm from a group in Queensland, Housing Older Women Movement, but we're not only about housing older women, but we have got the Minister for Housing interested in having a demonstration project using community land trust for more affordable dwellings in a co-housing type of middle density, missing middle type of infill, etc. And we are hoping to do something with a community housing provider as a partner, so that there are rentals and home buyers who would otherwise, in that great band of people who can't afford to buy a house nowadays. And that's why I'm asking if it's likely that James or others will be able to liaise with us, help us as we begin to persuade the planning authorities, etc., here in Queensland. It seems as if co-housing and community land trust and cooperative housing and things has never been, it has existed in Queensland, but it's sort of not spoken of. It doesn't exist now. So I'm hoping that that the sharing of your slides and things will also lead to perhaps some of the report and so forth like that coming to us.
Thanks, Linda. I think just to quickly respond to that's the sort of development that was previously prohibited on the RZ1 land here in the ACT, and through the reforms, we are opening up that as a different type of housing model that is available to people. So we have been very keen to look at the built form and make sure that it isn't sort of over-densifying, it isn't overdevelopment of the residential area, but then also introducing flexibility for the different ways and different housing models that people want to pursue, and having that flexibility to consider those sorts of proposals in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, James, and to the questioners. And as I said, we will try and get to some further questions, but we'll get to the next speaker now. So look, I'd just like to introduce the next speaker, which is Dr. Tim Helm, who is Director of Research and Policy at think tank Prosper Australia. Tim is an economist specialising in taxation, housing and infrastructure. He has worked as a freelance consultant and at Ernst & Young and the Victorian and New Zealand Treasuries. Tim has worked for local, state and federal governments on transport, housing and taxation, and regularly provides advice to inquiries, policymakers and media. His PhD is from the University of Melbourne and it examined the economics of land tax. Tim will focus in particular on today, I think, on the interaction between tax settings, including the least variation charge and upzoning. So welcome, Tim, and over to you.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you very much for inviting me here and pulling this together at such short notice. It's a pleasure to speak to you all. The caveat here will be that I'm not a Canberra local. I won't know the ins and outs of your planning system, and I'm going to really change tack a little bit from James's talk to take us over to property tax, which is broadly where my think tank is working within. So Prosper Australia is who I work for. We have quite a long history focused on really the intersection of land policy, housing policy and tax policy. And we come from the perspective that a tax system reform that reduces taxes on productive activity and raises more revenue by capturing windfall gains from land, resource rents, land rents, a system based on capturing unearned income for public revenue is going to be better for the economy and more just a way of raising revenue. So because of this history and this mission, we've actually had quite a lot of interest in Canberra over the years. And the ACT government has also been a leader in some policy reforms, such as stamp duty to land tax. We've also paid quite a lot of attention to the least variation charge as what we see as quite an unusual and really principled and really efficient in many ways instrument for pricing development rights, pricing property that's being transferred, in essence, from the territory to private landowners and which would otherwise crystallise in land value gains, unearned windfall gains. And as it so happens, as the territory is now considering changes to the least variation charge in the context of your missing middle upzoning, we happen to have been looking as part of a research project, examining quite closely the least variation charge over the last year as one amongst a number of options for enacting what we can call value capture, meaning the principle of capturing for public revenue private land value windfalls that come from public decisions. And most notably, those are the windfalls created through the planning system, but we can also think about value capture for infrastructure. So as we've gone to look at the different ways different states are going about capturing value, including the rezoning windfall gains tax in Victoria, we've actually settled upon the least variation charge, this quiet little instrument that sits on your budget books, settled on this as really like a best-in-class model for doing what it does, for capturing this value, a best-in-class model that we think other states should adopt as a means of no longer handing over these property rights for free to private landowners and allowing the financial benefit of that to crystallise on the private balance sheets. So at the same time as there are concessions being considered, and I think probably not necessarily a wide appreciation of the purpose and the operation and the efficiency of the least variation charge, at the same time as this is going on in Canberra, we're, if you like, holding up your model as best in class for Australia. So today I've worked in other areas too, including the interesting economics. I'm an economist. The economics of the way land use regulation, zoning reforms relates to housing supply and affordability. But I'll park that aside for today. Happy to take questions. And I want to focus on what I think many of you would be interested in and ACT government policymakers will be interested in, which is this question of whether the least variation charge as it's currently constituted and administered might be a barrier to housing supply, might be discouraging housing development, slowing down conversion of land to medium density uses, and particularly in these older suburbs, and whether the least variation charge might be working at odds to the policy goals that you've got with this reform. And I suppose then the follow-on question is, what can we expect? What can the territory expect if it proceeds with what the government has flagged in terms of concessions on missing middle housing types? in the lease variation charge. I'll just briefly sketch before then the type of arguments we're running in other states to hold up your model as a wonderful form of value capture, so that you understand really the purpose and operation of the charge if you're not familiar with it. So think about lease variation charge. Despite it being really a tax in the government budget papers, it's actually better conceived as a price for some property. It's a price that developers pay to vary the purpose on a lease in order to acquire those additional use rights for their land. So property, your title, is nothing more really than a bundle of rights guaranteed under law, circumscribed by the planning system, provided for in particular acts, enforced by courts and police. Property is a bundle of rights. When you add to the bundle's value grows. Now, the planning system gives you permission for something you couldn't previously do. That's adding to the bundle. And it's fair in principle that the public handing over those rights should be compensated by receiving full value for those rights instead of giving away rights that have market value for free. So that's the purpose of the lease variation charge, to price a right or some property, some publicly owned property that would otherwise be given away. And the really interesting feature is the charge is calibrated to the value that buyer will receive. And they would otherwise receive this in the form of a land value windfall. So using real estate records, land valuations, the Territory is setting up really a menu of prices by suburb. If you want to buy an additional 1 dwelling on your lease, you pay a certain amount. If you want to buy an additional 10, you pay a certain amount. And it varies, of course, by suburb according to demand for different locations. And the idea is that menu is quite well calibrated to the land value uplift that would otherwise be received, but the target being 75% of the value of those rights being captured through this price. It's mostly done through the schedule of codified charges, but for larger developments, there's a formula-based process looking at development residual profits, but also attempting to get the same 75% goal. Now, I suppose to look at what you're doing here, if I am a private landowner with land that has certain use rights attached, and I sell those rights, I sell that title to somebody else, I expect and hope to receive 100% of the value of the rights in the sale price. And market competition usually does that. We're simply asking the Territory or state governments generally to do the same principle when they transfer rights into private hands, to try and get as close to the market value of those rights as possible, as they possibly can. So it's the lease variation charge is the ACT's way of trying to be as commercially savvy as private sector land sellers would be. As you will well know, if you read news from other states, in the vast majority of Australia, corruption in the planning system is a huge problem, and that's driven in large part by these capital gains, these land value windfalls that are received through choices of rezoning and generous planning permissions. And that's a huge honeypot. These economic rents are a honeypot for corruption and rent seeking. And they're also a reason to speculate by holding land out of use rather than developing it. And the ACT has a good policy instrument in place to prevent this. We, as part of our report, we've been estimating the quantum of this. What's this worse than other states, the handover or the giveaway of value? We reckon more than $10 billion a year in other states has effectively been given in free wealth to existing property owners, such that if they were capturing 75%, as the lease variation charge does, this could pay for significant housing help for people that are currently locked out of housing markets. In terms, we think the amount that could be raised elsewhere could pay for abolition of stamp duty for all first home buyers. It's a huge leg up for non-homeowners. And secondly, a 50% increase in social housing stock in every state. So something like 200,000 additional social houses. That could be paid for simply by pricing instead of giving away development rights. So that's the purpose of the lease variation charge. Question being then, whether this charge is also deterring development. And if you look at the ACT's track record in building new housing at a rapid, really nation-leading rate of population growth, the answer should be obviously no, but we hear from the property industry claims in this respect, some of which have some forms of logic to them. So I'll briefly cover those. So the property industry, in the context of missing middle housing, there are some claims that lease variation charge will be added as a cost and passed on to the end user in terms of a higher house price. This kind of pass-through idea. This one's a real furphy. Developers are price takers. When these charges are well signaled, as anyone that's done a bit of feasibility analysis knows, or any planner knows, the development market will price it into what they pay for land. So the effect of these taxes or prices is to reduce the land price. The land price is flexible and it will absorb these taxes. So this is it's a bit of a furphy. There's an interesting idea that lease variation charge might be skewing development types away from more and smaller units towards fewer and larger units. And I think this is probably not so material. It's claimed on the basis that it's a per dwelling charge, but embedded in the design of the charge is a diminishing price the more dwellings you put on your site. And that's coming from real estate sales records, which in essence reflect the market's valuation of land with different lease purposes attached to it, land with different types of rights attached to it. So compared to some of these development charges in other states, which are a very fixed per dwelling charge, irrespective of how many dwellings are built, lease variation charge has a good bit of flexibility built into it that I don't think it's probably skewing the market in the way sometimes claimed. But nationwide, we are seeing a lot of the apartment market shift towards larger, higher value dwellings. And that's a national trend. So I don't think it's any kind of local policy effect. Now, the most interesting claim, I suppose, is that or concern is that the lease variation charge will make some developments infeasible. Some changes of use that would otherwise have occurred will no longer be worth pursuing, and that may reduce housing supply. And that's sort of one of the claims, and it's worth interrogating a little. And the kernel of truth here is that where there's a property that has high value structures on it, such that a change of use, replacing the existing structures and putting up new ones, such that that change of use is pretty marginal, then the lease variation charge may tip that development into infeasibility. If you have like a high quality structure built 10 years ago, it's adding $500,000 value to the land, and the next best, or the development project, if you demolished it, would add net of costs, say $600,000. Then any price greater than $100,000 for those incremental use rights is going to discourage that from happening. But there's a really critical point here in this argument, which is that feasibility of development is a necessary condition for that development to go ahead, but it's not sufficient. In fact, there are many sites that can have a feasible change of use, and they proceed through to development depending on how feasible they are. And a site that has high value structures is always going to be held for a long time until those structures depreciate, and until that site is development ready, until it's the right time to develop the site. And for sites where the structures are depreciated and they're adding no more value to the land, the lease variation charge, as it's being calculated, is a price that's just right for the value that the developers get in exchange for what they're paying. You know, setting aside whether the tax, the price is appropriately calculated, in principle, the design of the thing, aiming for 75% of the land value uplift, is suitable for land that is about to be developed. So for all the buyers of these property rights that we want to buy the rights, those buyers are certainly going to be willing to pay this price. And it's only land that's barely feasible to develop that may be tipped into infeasibility by lease variation charge. And that's land that wouldn't proceed through to development anyway, because it's far from the optimal time to bowl those structures and replace it with new ones. This land ripens towards development readiness as structures depreciate. And it doesn't matter really if we're reducing the feasible pool very slightly, the pool of feasible capacity, because only a tiny fraction of that feasible pool actually proceeds to development. And it happens in a sequence, starting with the sites that are most feasible. So lease variation charge, I think it's a subtle point that I've raised, but it's important, I think, as a headline conclusion for anyone involved in this area to recognise there isn't a strong argument that lease variation charge is standing in the way of any types of redevelopment, missing middle included. Development's always going to happen in certain sites above others first. So what then would be the effects of issuing these concessions? I think what can the ACT expect? Not necessarily any kind of increase in housing supply from issuing concessions to missing middle housing. There's a limited buyer market for each type of development, including townhouses, including low density apartments. And so developers aren't going to rush to overbuild if it means sacrificing sites that could be held in their current use if there's a good structure on it, or developed at a later time when the market's ready for absorbing more units of that type. So I think the principle of, I suppose, skewing ownership towards certain housing types, such as social and community housing providers above commercial providers, that's a legitimate objective that you can try and achieve with the lease variation charge. But the idea you can use the lease variation charge to boost housing supply per se, lift the overall rate of production of new housing, that's a bit of a furphy. I don't think that's well justified in economic terms. Possibly lease variation concessions might skew activity away from greenfields towards missing middle, but again, I don't think that's likely to be material since there's limited and differential markets for all these different types of housing. So actually, I'll really close here. The key point is that if you take a tax off land by cutting lease variation charge for medium density development in a whole swathe of existing suburbs, then the primary effect of that is just to lead to that land value rising. It's not going to make it any easier for a future developer to acquire that site and develop it. They're still going to be on razor thin margins. What's happening here is that the existing owners of that land, especially if that land doesn't have much in the way of structure value on it, those owners get a windfall. They've already received a little windfall thanks to the rezoning. And if the tax that was expected when they bought the site is actually removed or reduced, their windfall will only grow. So the budget cost of this is you're losing revenue and you're potentially making it more attractive to sit on sites rather than developing them. And you're actually channeling value into the hands of private landowners in ways that the lease variation charge was intended to prevent. So yeah, I'll close on that and really happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I can see there was some things posted in the chat, a bit of discussion. Actually, one question, please, if anyone does have a question, pop your hand up. But one question was if Tim, there's obviously a lot of interest in the research paper. Is that available to share, or is that going to be available to share soon?
Yeah, we're actually targeting probably early May for a release. Yeah, it's been on the boil for a while. It's going to be a research paper broadly called Pricing Development Rights. It'll be around about that, and we'll make sure that we circulate it with the ACT Shelter and so on. So it'll be Prosper Australia is the organisation releasing it, and we're looking at around May for that research paper.
That'll be great. I mean, obviously the windfall gains taxes and other sort of regimes is an issue in other jurisdictions, but I know in the ACT, the lease variation charge there's been a lot of focus on it. And I'm sure that will be very interesting to see that paper. I can see Anthony Gill, did you have a question that you wanted to ask Tim?
Anthony, you're muted.
Just see.
There, that's better. You've certainly got your head right down deep into the lease variation charges, Tim. Thanks for that. I'm trying to get my head around that mechanism where there's gain to be had, and it's either collected for the public good and tipped back into housing, or it's taken by the private developers in their profits. Can that be likened to the Victorian situation where you've got land tax, residential vacancies tax, and we've heard where the investors have fled Victoria, so the Victorian property prices have been subdued, not rising quite so much as other states. Is that a similar sort of mechanism there that would help me understand that?
Yeah, look, the two ways that sort of explain the general point are, one, rights are property. There's nothing to property more than a bundle of rights. You add rights, the value goes up. So you can take examples from Sydney. You know, the news media loves these, where there's some upzoning around train stations or whatever it is. Everybody gets a huge windfall. People in Rose Bay have, you know, whatever their property price triples. This is the obvious, you know, windfall gain. It's also the obvious source of a great degree of corruption. So it's just a handover of property. That's the best way of conceiving it, is that state governments, by and large, are sort of dupes handing over property for free instead of actually pricing it, as any commercially savvy organisation would when they're selling off their assets. That's in essence what's going on with unpriced upzoning or unpriced planning permission. The planning permission is really where the transfer of rights happens, but because planning permission is typically received without due consideration, without payment, at the point of upzoning, people anticipate that, and you see these windfall gains at upzoning, which in fact is the strength of the lease variation charge, because Victoria's windfall gains tax only applies at the point of upzoning. So only a small portion of the value provided by the whole planning pipeline or the planning system, only a small portion of that actually crystallizes at the point of upzoning. So it's a very narrow tax base compared to the lease variation charge, which takes the full value of the chain of use. As for your point about other taxes, such as land tax and vacant residential land tax, the key point to bear in mind here is land has no production cost. It's not like say tradies or other labour inputs to construction that have some cost to provide. Yes, developers pay a price for land, but that price can be anywhere between zero and anything. And that price flexes depending on the residual value from developing it. And any tax, just whatever it is, expected land tax for the new occupant, an expected vacant residential land tax, a lease variation charge, infrastructure contributions, all of that is factored in to what developers pay for land. It all reduces land prices, and it means there cannot be any impact of these taxes being passed through to home buyers, unless the impact is to slow down development. And that's a case-by-case basis, depending on the property tax. Excuse me, coming up a cold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that, I mean, that's been incredibly useful, Tim. And I think we might even come back to a few more questions about the lease variation charge in the panel session. But I might move on now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Ed Wensing. Ed is Associate and Special Advisor at SGS Economics and Planning and a Research Fellow at the Cities Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. He's an experienced planner, researcher, policy analyst and academic with experience across government, the private sector, non-government organisations and professional associations, as well as research and teaching roles at several Australian universities. Ed has published extensively and continues to contribute across a broad range of public policy fields. Thank you, Ed. Over to you.
Thanks, Corinne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the Ngambri Ngaragu and Ngunnawal country, and I respect the connections of the traditional owners and thank them for their custodianship of the land we live on. I've just got a few quick points to make. I've lived in Canberra all my life. I've worked across Australia in different contexts and have travelled extensively throughout Australia and occasionally overseas as well. I just want to make some very quick observations. The origin of Canberra's leasehold system goes back to the works of Henry George, actually, because when you look at the parliamentary debates in the early parts of the last century, which led to the formation of our leasehold legislation, two of our politicians at the time, Senator Ray in about 1912 and Senator John Grant in the 1920s, referred extensively to speeches that Henry George had given in the preceding century. So the roots of our lease variation charge are very deep and long in history. And I spent 25 years of my life from the 1970s through to the early 2000s basically defending our leasehold system, and my personal papers of that period are now in the National Library of Australia. But as a long-time observer and defender of our unique leasehold system, I'll make the comment that the lease variation charge is actually an integral part of our unique leasehold system, and that great care needs to be exercised when making changes that may erode its effectiveness. Any suggestions of scrapping it will have to be met with a replacement developer contribution charge, because there's no such thing as a free lunch anymore. Every additional dwelling and every change in land use has externality costs that are an impost on the running of the city, and they need to be funded some way. The foundation of my remarks is based on the fact that in every jurisdiction in Australia, the Crown retains the rights to land even when supposedly absolute ownership is granted through freehold, and even in the nature of leasehold in the ACT. The Crown always retains the ownership of the development rights in land, which is something that Tim alluded to. These rights do not automatically attach to freehold or leasehold. Any change in development rights have to be secured through the planning system, and the Crown may give or withhold development permission at its absolute discretion. Now, I have a bit of trouble with the wording when we say the approval system. I don't see the system as an approval system. I call it an assessment system, because the minister always holds the discretion to refuse the application or to vary it, and not just simply approve it. Land may be zoned for certain purposes and development types, and it may be traded privately in anticipation of those development rights foreshadowed by the planning system. But until such time as a permit is issued, no compensable rights exist. Moreover, the Crown may change the planning rules at any time, and again at its absolute discretion, which is what it's currently doing through the variations to the Tier 2 plan and the RZ1 and RZ2 categories. The point at which the lease variation charge applies is when the additional development rights are actually granted. And the other comment I would make is that concessions or discounts to the lease variation charge need to be very carefully considered for their long-term impacts, because they have the potential to undermine the system. The other thing I want to do is to respond to one of the questions in the chat. Jules Bray says, I'm aware of a large parcel of land in northern Canberra that would be ideal for affordable housing, but the religious body that owns it can't afford to develop it. And if selling part of it to pay the developer, will it lose so much in lease variation charges that it's not feasible for them to do so? Well, my answer to that is a bit different to James's answer. It would depend in part on when the original lease was granted and under which statute at the time, because in the early days of Canberra's development, the government gave away land so that sites would be developed for community purposes like churches, for example. And if it was issued under the old church lands leases ordinance, it was probably issued for a penny or a pound. And at no other cost to the lessee. My position would be that if the lease is to be changed in its value for another purpose, the church has no right to the future development options under that lease arrangement. It should hand the lease back to the Crown. The Crown can then put the site on the market if it chooses to put it on the market as a way of disposing of it, or it can put it through a select tender process, or in fact hand it over to the public housing system to develop it for public or community housing. And that way the government captures the full increase in value of the land. Of course, the lessee should be entitled to the compensation for the value of any improvements to the land, but not for the loss of the lease, particularly not if the lease was granted for a peppercorn sum in the first place. And they're important principles in our leasehold system that come from its origins and its original legislation, which has partially been lost through the many changes that have been made over the years. The other comment I would make is that I'm also aware of several blocks of land in Canberra, individual residential blocks that have been vacant for a long time. And I know for a fact that those sites would be in breach of their lease purpose clause, and that is that the land must be put to its use and kept in use. If it's out of use for more than 12 months, the Crown has a right to repossess the land. The failure in the ACT system is that we don't have a culture of enforcement in this space. Those parcels should be taken off those lessees because they're speculating in the system, and speculation's not good. Not good for the system in any way, shape or form, and it should be stopped. Those sites need to be resumed. I've also made some comments through the Canberra Times almost 12 months ago about the limits to Canberra's growth, and there are 5 particular limits that I see that I'm concerned are not being fully addressed in our long-term strategic planning. The city was planned for a population of 500,000. We're approaching that very quickly. James said we're going to reach the 750,000 probably within the next decade or more. There are physical limits to how far we can go, and the physical limits are really crucial. The first one is the border. We might be negotiating a slight extension out at West Belconnen to cover Ginninderry. That's all well and good. But if you want to build another new town of 90 to 100,000 people, the only place that's really suitable for that in topographical terms is land to the north of Belconnen and Gungahlin. And that would have to be purchased by the Commonwealth. And I mean purchased. Commonwealth can't acquire land without compensation on just terms under section 5131 of our Constitution. And the High Court has set several precedents for that in other contexts. The other four constraints are really, two of them are deeply intertwined, and that is the travel demand and the topography. We are limited with external growth because of the nature of our topography within the ACT. The city was designed on a linear scale to achieve economies in operation and economic efficiency by having reverse loading in our travel demand. We could achieve that when we had a linear arrangement between our principal centres of employment. And I've long expressed the view that I think the developments that have occurred out of the airport have distorted that. And similarly, the residential developments in the Molonglo have also distorted that linear arrangement. And while we're now beginning to build a public transport system, a fixed rail system, I do think in some respects it's not capable of living up to the long-term demand when we get to 1 million people. And I think there are issues there that need to be looked at. The other two constraints are also deeply intertwined with each other, which is water and sewerage. We live in the driest continent on Earth. We're in one of the most stretched river systems in the country, the Murray-Darling Basin. There's currently a review of the Upper Murrumbidgee underway because the Snowy Hydro Agreement pulls out more than 90% of the water from the Upper Murrumbidgee for hydroelectricity purposes. And between Tantangara Dam and Burrinjuck Dam, the river is dying. So we need to have a really serious look at how that's operating, which thanks to David Pocock, that's now currently underway. But nevertheless, we're the country's largest inland city. We have to treat our sewerage to 100%. It has to be drinkable at the other end because downstream from us, we provide potable water for a lot of communities, including Adelaide, by the way, at the end of the river system, and food production in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. So we have to produce high quality water out of our wastewater system. And at present, although the sewerage system's been extended to arguably to cope for 700,000, what are we going to do when we get to 1 million? Are we going to build another lower Molonglo Water Quality Control Centre of the same standard and capacity to cope with that extra 500,000 people? And where do we put it when we don't quite know where some of that growth is going to be? And even increases in density in our existing urban fabric also place serious demands on our water supply and sewerage and even our stormwater systems for that matter. And so these things all need to be looked at as part of the overall scheme of developing this city for the next 500,000 people. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Does anyone have any questions for Ed? Just what people are thinking maybe about that. I have a bit of a question, Ed, and I know you've pointed to some of those challenges about that expanding population. But if we're thinking about, population is going to continue to grow in the ACT, and we're thinking also about what that means in terms of equity and affordability. If we're thinking about how we can best do that, there are implications as well if we do continue to sprawl outward with those lower density suburbs. There's equity and affordability as well as obviously environmental and ecological implications of that. So did you want to, just putting your urban planning sort of hat on as well and just thinking about what that means socially and economically, if we're looking at how as the population increases, how can we actually accommodate people in the way that we're going to mitigate some of those potential problems? what should we be focusing on? I mean, is missing middle part of that and trying to increase that supply of more medium density rather than just having that ever sprawling outward suburbs?
Yes, clearly the missing middle has to be part of that. Our households are generally much smaller than they were 4 decades ago. And
although the house sizes are getting bigger still, I noticed in the ACT for the detached houses, they're huge.
Indeed they are. Indeed they are. Look, Canberra enjoys a reasonable degree of amenity because of its low density. But when we compare the density figures for this city against even other Australian cities, we have a very high proportion of low density housing. So there's a bit of an assumption there that there's capacity within the system to increase the density. That's true. And that was the reason why I asked the question earlier about land assembly for small developments of no more than 2 or 3 existing residential blocks being amalgamated when the time is right. And I think there are things we can do through the land assembly process using the leasehold system to enable that to occur in a more streamlined and economic fashion that's more affordable for those people that are happy to make that transition happen on their own land, including even dual occupancies and splitting the blocks. So they all have to be part of the equation. And of course, the other factor that I think needs to be taken into account is the impact on public open space. We know from research over many decades that the private residential quarter-acre block provides 3 opportunities for use of open space. Part of it is amenity, that is the setback from the front boundary, and that's often used for landscaping and whatever, and aids with orientation. Secondly, there is the private open space that's used for personal recreation, and then the third component is the utility open space where you park your garbage and your garden shed and your car or whatever, and your caravan and your boat. When we reduce block sizes down to 400 square metres or less, and I see some of this in the new subdivisions in parts of Gungahlin, for example, where I live, there's no space for landscaping to grow above the roofline, and therefore there's no release from the urban heat that's generated, and particularly not when the roofs are all black. Why we still approve black roofed houses in this climate is beyond me. We shouldn't be. And so that's a consideration that has to be taken into account. I was pleased to hear James say that in response to my question about open space considerations, that at least that's a factor that's hopefully being considered in the amalgamation processes that are occurring and will be accommodated in the design guides or in the pattern books. Look, and there are always opportunities that the government should be looking for and the planners should be looking for social and community housing in all of these. The current proportion, the reason why we have a housing crisis is basically because the economics of it is screwed. And the economics of it is screwed because the Commonwealth and the states have basically walked away from providing public housing. It's now, less than 5% of the total stock across the nation. It's appalling. Why are the queues for public housing and community housing so long? Well, principally because governments have walked away from their obligations and created housing as only an investment vehicle. For goodness sakes, scrap the negative gearing and the capital gains tax exemptions for starters to try and balance the scales, and then direct more of that investment toward public housing. I think I saw figures the other day that said that if you scrap those 2 components, you'd have money in the budget to do some more wonderful things in the public housing space. Well, let's see it happen.
Look, I would agree with you there, Jeff. It definitely, and I'm sure I could have a discussion with you about the broader tax settings at a federal level as well. But
Linus has
that
come
might
in
be
and said 3% of housing stock. There you go.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much. We might pull out some of those things further in the panel discussion if we get time. We'll see how we go. But I might move now to our next speaker, who is Professor Kathy Sherry. Kathy is a leading Australian expert on strata and community title. She's a professor in the Macquarie University Law School, an executive member of the Smart Green Cities Research Centre, and a member of the Macquarie University Housing and Urban Research Centre. Her research focuses on the legal, social and economic complexities of strata and other forms of collectively owned property, particularly in higher density housing. She is the author of prominent and highly cited publications in the area of property law and regularly advises governments in Australia and overseas on laws governing multi-owned properties and higher density housing. Thank you. Kathy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Thank you very much for asking me. I was going to start by saying unlike Ed, I don't live in Canberra. I do live in Sydney, though I do have an odd connection to Canberra, and that is that Strathnairn, the new suburb there, was my husband's grandparents' farm. So I was there quite recently, which was quite interesting to see how it's developed and to know the cafe was my father-in-law's bedroom. But there's one other caveat I want to say about Canberra is that I'm not going to be specifically talking about the leasehold system, though I do understand some of it, but I can certainly try and answer questions in relation to that. So what I'm going to be addressing today is strata title, which is something that I think is incredibly concerning all across Australia, and it's wonderful to have James here from the Department of Planning. Is the almost complete disconnect between planning law and private property law, in particular strata title, because governments all across Australia have become convinced that high density housing is the solution to the housing affordability crisis. I think there's all sorts of questions to unpack in that economically, but I'll put them to one side. But it is almost inevitable that it's inevitable that all of that high density housing will be strata and much of the medium density housing will be strata. And it has incredibly important implications for the livability of that housing and for its affordability. But that is routinely simply never considered in the planning system. So I want to start by, I haven't got PowerPoints, but I want to start by talking about the absolute basics of strata title that I think are overlooked. So the most common interest in land in Australia, of course, is a freehold fee simple. Now, strata titles are freehold, torrens title, fees simple. Not, again, I'm going to say Canberra, of course, is slightly different, but all strata titles are freehold, fee simple, torrens titles, unless you're at a Queensland island or on the foreshore of Sydney Harbour, no matter what a real estate agent tells you. But they fundamentally differ from other forms of freehold titles in one key way. Now, the key attribute of a freehold title as opposed to a leasehold title is that you will never be made to pay money by virtue of buying your interest in land. This is not an accident. It's an incredibly important rule of orthodox property law that helped us dismantle the feudal pyramid and build liberal, democratic, capitalist land markets. So I'm going to say this very quickly. I'm not going to talk about feudalism, but in a feudal society, ownership of land meant incredibly complex relationships with a whole lot of people up and above you and below you in the feudal pyramid, and also, of course, obligations to pay feudal dues, which were originally things like agricultural services, admin services, providing knights, things like that. They were eventually turned into payments of money. One of the key ways we dismantled feudalism was getting rid of a whole lot of property rules that allowed people to create property titles that were coupled with obligations to do things for other people, the most important one being the obligation to pay money. The result is, of course, that if you buy a house in the suburbs in Australia, you're buying a freehold fee simple, you pay your vendor, you pay your local council rates, but you can never be made to make other ongoing monetary payments. You will never be compelled to employ your vendor's cleaner, and you will never be compelled to buy electricity or water from a particular supplier. That's not an accident. It is a very conscious choice by property law, and it's the result of the rule of property law that prohibits the imposition of positive obligations, for example, to pay money on freehold land titles. So a developer cannot chop up a chicken farm on the outskirts of Sydney, create new land titles and impose on them obligations for all of the future owners to pay money, because judges, legislatures know from hard cold experience that if you let developers do that, they will load land up with obligations to pay money that benefit them and their mates. So it's a very sensible rule of property law, and it is benefiting every single person who owns a non-strata property in Australia today. However, the rule creates a real problem for the maintenance of apartment buildings. So if you want to sell people freehold fee simple titles to apartments, which is what Dick Dusseldorp wanted to do when strata title was invented in developed in New South Wales. Strata is not an Australian invention, no matter what people say. It's absolutely not. We copied it from overseas. But if you want to sell people freehold titles to apartments as opposed to leasehold, which is how apartments are sold in the United Kingdom, you've got to deal with this rule, because you have to make people pay for the upkeep of the building. And that is the single most important thing that strata title legislation does. The levying provision, that is that provision to pay money annually for the upkeep of the building, overrides this ordinary rule of property law. And it makes perfect sense. Okay, you've got to maintain the building. There's no problem with it. It makes perfect sense. The problem is, however, as soon as you breach that rule, the little chink in the armour, you open the floodgates. As soon as you can make people pay money by virtue of owning land, you've created an income stream. And developers and the property strata industry absolutely recognise levies for exactly that. So it's one of the reasons why there are so many problems in strata title developments, why there's so much consumer complaint, because people are paying for their levies, not simply for the upkeep of the building, but they're often paying for contracts that have been formed, negotiated by the developer, and the body corporate has been made to enter that contract, for example, for complex energy infrastructure or public open space, all sorts of things like that. And as soon as you buy an apartment and you become a member of the body corporate, you are obliged to pay its debt. So whatever contracts it's entered into, you didn't negotiate them, you may not have even known about them, you're going to have to be paying them. So we're now in a situation where I think strata worked pretty well for a long period of time, but I think we're running into real difficulties now. I should say, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. The starting point for this is strata is like democracy. It is not perfect, but it's the best system on offer. And with all due respect to, I know there's a lot of talk about things like community housing trusts. They concern me greatly. It's not legal title that makes housing affordable. It's that someone's given you the underlying land for free or has given you a large whack of money. It's got nothing to do with the legal title. And that concerns me. A lot of attempts to solve housing affordability through different legal structures doesn't make a blind bit of difference what the legal structure is. You have to have, someone has to have provided a lot of the value for you for free for it to be affordable. And strata title can do that. There's no doubt strata title can do that. It's a very good system. It's just a question of how we use it. So strata is definitely the best system on offer. I'm not suggesting we use something else. But I think we need to be really acutely aware of the way in which owners in strata title can be vulnerable to original owners, that is the developer, and also people who are subsequently involved in the development, loading land up with obligations to pay money that owners will have to pay through levies. And what we've seen in large-scale complex developments, Central Park is the plant cover development that's opposite UTS next to Central Station in Sydney. Governments love to put it on brochures as the kind of poster child for high-density urban development with lots of sustainability features. The levies for a two-bedroom apartment in Central Park are $15,000 a year. That is a staggering amount of money. There are some strata schemes that have levies of $100,000 a year. They're the really high-end ones. But $15,000 a year is a staggering amount of money. If you spent $150,000 over 10 years on your freestanding home, you would have done a substantial renovation of some description. But you can spend $150,000 over 10 years in a strata apartment, and all you have paid for is lots of services for your strata manager and the various people who are running all sorts of infrastructure associated with the development. And it's possible that even the maintenance hasn't been done. So, Corinne, sorry, how much time have I got? I've just lost track.
You can keep going for a few more minutes, Kathy. That's fine.
Okay, so the real risk that I see at the moment is there is so little attention and understanding in relation to strata title that we are busy planning medium to high density cities with, I think, potentially a lot of the people who are involved in the planning, planners, architects, designers, landscape architects, who for very good reason want really good amenities. They want good open space. They want sustainability infrastructure and housing for very understandable reasons, but they have no idea that the people who will be paying for it are the young people and the old people who will be buying those apartments. And I apologise, James, but I don't think it's a question of choice. I think if we all had a choice, we'd be living on 3 acres in Vaucluse. Most of our housing choices are a result of that we have no other financial choice about what we buy. We buy what we can afford. And there is, it seems to me, no possibility that the kind of complex strata, and I'm going to say the word stratum, which probably doesn't mean much to many people, but stratum subdivisions are large mixed-use subdivisions that are built on amalgamated sites because councils and governments like amalgamation for master planning. And what you end up with is an unbelievably complex beast of a development where everyone is legally yoked together. The costs that you are paying for the infrastructure can often be astronomical because so much infrastructure that has hitherto been publicly provided by governments or local councils is now becoming common property in a strata scheme or shared facilities in stratum subdivision. And if people don't know what that shared facilities in the stratum subdivision is, I'm happy to explain it in questions, but you need to know because it's how high density mixed use development is being done. The legal structure is mind-bogglingly complicated and it is incredibly expensive. So the two things I will finish on. One is when the ACT is thinking about medium density development, you must, and if anyone speaks to the planners in New South Wales Department of Planning, you must not make development that does not need to be strata title. So you must not make semis and terraces strata title. If they do not have common property or any significant common property, they should be ordinary subdivisions of the kind that we've seen for 2 centuries in Australia. So for example, the pattern book competition in New South Wales, there was, I don't mean to be mean to the students because it was the students' design, it was great, but they had a row of terraces and they had shared parking, sorry, I put my hands in the thing, row of terraces with shared parking on either end. The moment they put 4 shared parking spaces in, they just made it strata title. They just made all of those owners subject to hundreds of sections of legislation, obligations to pay levies, a private governing body corporate, the necessity to employ a strata manager, the whole catastrophe for shared parking spaces. So you cannot uncritically make things strata title if it doesn't need to be. What's happened in New South Wales is we've got 2 lot strata schemes because the lots are apparently not big enough to do a subdivision. Strata is a Torrens title subdivision. That's what it is. It's just with complexity. And then the second thing I would say is everybody who is involved in the planning of high density cities, from planners to architects to landscape architects, has to think about every single element that they put in a plan for amenity, for facilities, for good community infrastructure. You need to think who owns it, who owns the private property title, because everything is owned by somebody. It's not possible for it not to be owned. It's not owned by the community. It's either owned by the local council, the state government, or private citizens. Who owns it? And then who pays for it? And the answer is that if it's strata or stratum, unlike non-strata properties where people cannot be compelled to pay money because the ongoing money because they own property, that's exactly what strata requires them to do. So if you're going to put in a tri-generation plant, a roof garden, publicly accessible open space that's a shared facility in a stratum subdivision, an embedded network, all sorts of hydraulic infrastructure, batteries, you name it, if it is going to end up as common property, it is going to be paid for by those younger and older homeowners who you are possibly trying to provide affordable housing to. I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, thank you. That was great. And I think it's really useful to have that perspective because I think we have had some focuses in other jurisdictions around some of the issues around strata title. But I think when we've been talking about missing middle housing, it just hasn't really come into the picture as much. And I think it's important to have that perspective there. Look, I just want to go to questions. I can see we do have a hand up. Let me just see who that is. David, did you have a question for Kathy?
Yes, Kathy, I wonder if you could expand a little more in terms of what you've been saying about costs and people getting yoked with them, what the potential differences are then between ACT leasehold system and the freehold developments that you've talked about across the rest of Australia. What are the potentials there for the ACT in that respect?
I think this is going to be a really out there thing for people to hear, but you don't actually need a Unit Titles Act at all, because you could impose obligations to pay money in leases. But the reality is the ACT tends to follow other states. Now, the queen of ACT strata, who is the real expert, is a woman called Susan Proctor, who's one of my fellow members of the Australian College of Australian strata lawyers, and Susan's the real expert in this area. And I heard her give a great paper last week. The reality is the ACT copies the development model from other states. Most people wouldn't realise that technically you don't actually need legislation if you have a leasehold system, because you can put obligations to pay money in leases. But having worked on, been consulted on with lots of countries, so Pacific Islands, the Middle East, that also have leasehold systems, they still tend to use the strata title system because it's a form of property that developers recognise globally, particularly in the Pacific, with Australian developers building tourist resorts or whatever. So, I mean, that's the reality is what you'll end up with in the ACT won't be very much different to other states, because developers are working across borders and they tend to build the same thing.
Thank you.
Libby, did you have a question? You might have popped your hand down. Maybe not. So maybe just one thing I'll just ask Kathy is in terms of, if we are thinking about affordability, because often an argument is made that this will lead to much more affordable housing, but do we need to consider, if we're thinking about strata titled housing, we need to factor in those ongoing costs as part of the affordability, because I think there's often a focus on the ticket price when something's sold. But is that and welcome also to your cat. But is that something we also need to be thinking about when we're talking about affordability, if we're looking at that type of housing?
Absolutely. So at the moment, after the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, the biggest instigator of personal bankruptcy in New South Wales are strata bodies corporate. That means people lose their homes. Now, there's a lot more to unpack in that, but there's absolutely, for example, my kids are in their late 20s, early 30s, and I mean, I must admit, knowing what I know about strata, I advise them do anything not to buy strata. Buy outside Sydney. Don't buy in Sydney. Don't buy into a development where you could end up getting whacked with massive special levies, or your levies will just keep going up and you don't really have any control over it. It is a huge financial risk. I should also say it's a financial risk for community housing providers. So I held a day with Mission Australia last year at UNSW, because of the uplift in New South Wales that developers are getting if they include affordable housing in their developments. They're getting a 30% uplift. A lot of community housing providers are acquiring stock. Sometimes it's salt and pepper apartments. Sometimes it's a stratum. So they're, maybe an entire tower, maybe 5 floors of a building. They're buying into these really complex stratum developments where at the outset when they buy, they actually can't know what the real costs will be. The contracts will disclose there may be an embedded network, there may be a tri-generation plant, there may be contracts for this, contracts for that. They've got no idea what the real costs are. And I actually think that community housing providers, funders, should be extremely concerned about this, particularly given the fact that a lot of this community housing sadly only has a 15-year limit on it. So it will turn, a lot of the investment is happening on the basis it'll turn back into market housing in 15 years. I'd be saying to the funders, who actually have quite a lot of faith that they might be able to help fix some of this stuff, you need to understand what those costs are going to be, because in 15 years' time, if that development is riddled with building defects, everyone's complaining about the contracts and the fact that they're tied into contracts they can't get out of that are exorbitantly expensive and exploitative. The asset that you're going to be attempting to sell in 15 years' time is maybe not going to be worth what you think it's worth because of all of these burdens that are being imposed.
Great point. Libby, did you have a question?
Yes. The ACT Assembly has just is in the process of writing a report from a major inquiry into strata that got more submissions than any other inquiry they've ever done. The UTMA is largely unintelligible to owners and, sadly, managers. We need major amendment of that legislation to match what is being done with the planning and the constant construction of enormous strata buildings in the ACT. I agree entirely with Kathy. I constantly get emails on behalf of Owners Corporation Network from owners in developments that are dual locks or 3 or 4 units with virtually no common property. And for God's sake, why are they strata developments? But we need major legislation amendment in the ACT to make the system work. Maybe the wrong forum to say that, but oh God almighty, we need it. Thank you.
It's so not the wrong forum. It's because the reality is, if we are talking about medium to high density development, it will be strata. Like a lot of it has to be, there's no choice. Some of it doesn't have to. But we have to connect these two things. We cannot keep planning high density cities with no understanding or attention to the reality of what those high density cities are. And I know, for example, in New South Wales, I work a bit with Fair Trading, who are just working so hard to try and fix strata law. And it just becomes this just endless process of amending sections of legislation. I've been involved in strata reform for decades now. And I keep getting, over the years, I've had so many phone calls from, junior people in various departments all across Australia saying, I've got this section of this act that I have been told to look at. Could you help me? And I'll say to them, so how long have you been working on this? They'll say 6 weeks. Are you a property lawyer? No. Do you have any experience of strata? No. What we're asking of them is just impossible. I feel so much for fair trading departments. They are working so hard, but we just need everyone to understand strata better, and we need to stop doing piecemeal reform of strata legislation. It needs to be done, properly, with a realistic amount of time by a law reform commission.
Agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, there was some good questions there in the chat. And maybe, Ed, I've got your hand up. Look, I know there actually is quite a bit there. I think it's provoked quite a bit of discussion, Kathy, which is great, but I'm just mindful of the time. So I might now just go to our final speaker, and perhaps we can see, I think we're going to be running out of time here, I suspect, but we'll see if we can come back to some of those questions. But I'll go now to our final speaker, as I mentioned, which is Nathan Dalbon. Nathan Dalbon, and I just realized that I don't actually have your bio in front of me. Just give me a moment. We're done here.
That's okay. You can say it on top.
You have a very long, and I must admit, Nathan, and all of the speakers are very somewhat intimidating and long bios, and very impressive. Nathan is, just as I try and find the document where it is. Oh dear. I do have it now in front of me. So Nathan is the CEO of CHC, and he brings extensive experience in public policy and advisory roles with deep expertise in housing policy. This includes spending 6 years as CEO of Housing Australia and its predecessor, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, where he was the inaugural CEO and led the design and delivery of major national initiatives, including the bond aggregator, the Home Guarantee Scheme, and the Housing Australia Future Fund, alongside an influential research program which included the State of the Nation Housing Report. Nathan has extensive experience in roles across the Commonwealth and as advisors to Shadow Treasurers and as a non-executive director of Ahuri, as well as representing Australia at the UN on sustainable development financing, among other things as well. So look, wonderful to have you with us. Nathan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Corinne. And good to be here. I must confess, after hearing a discussion on LVC planning and strata reform, I was expecting to feel a little bit sleepy by this point. But I'd have to say I've learned a lot. It was a truly fascinating conversation across all the topics. So look, I'll be very brief. I just want to talk a little bit about, I guess, CHC and probably bringing a community housing provider perspective. And I think on the missing middle, I guess I can talk in sort of general terms. I mean, there's a few specifics that I would sort of highlight from I guess, a CHP point of view, but then also maybe just touch on quickly some of the current sort of initiatives, given the focus that the government has in terms of achieving a target of 5,000 more social and affordable homes and public by over the next 5 years. So, look, I think, so CHC, just quickly for people who don't know, we're a Canberra-based CHP. CHP has been operating over 25 years. We have about 1,000 properties that we manage or own, largely across the ACT. Also, probably a little bit different to some other CHPs, most of our history has been undertaking developments, whereby we've sold off a lot of the properties and then used the development margin to then cross-subsidise the retention of typically long-term affordable rentals. So I think one of the important lessons from that history and also moving forward is the importance of securing land for community housing providers. And I think as a community housing provider offering largely subsidised rental services, when you're out there sort of competing for land, you're never going to compete with private players. The inherent value of the land is never going to be the same because you're essentially offering a sub-market product. So I guess while I recognise that, increasing the amount of supply of land is going to be important in terms of accommodating the increase in population, probably one of the things that will need to be considered is that if you're going to be, potentially improving supply across these RZ1 sites in particular, that while this land will be available to community housing providers to purchase, unless there's some form of either a subsidy, like at the moment through the half round through an availability payment, or unless there's some other form of incentive, it's going to be very difficult for a CHP just on the basis of returns to compete against a private market developer or participant. So that's just something I would sort of suggest in terms of, going forward would be important to consider in terms of how do you ensure you have that sort of, mixture of cohorts across regions within the ACT or areas across the ACT. Because I think, if we're talking about vibrant communities, and it's good to hear, Ed talk about some of those aspects, because we know that increasing supply is probably a necessary and important aspect of improving affordability, but it's not necessarily the only consideration. If you have a look at the moment in terms of like my experience, I guess, with the ACT is that there's lots of projects out there that have DA approval. So there's plenty of potential supply, but these projects simply don't stack up at this point. So there's a lot of other factors that will impact on affordability, but then it's not just about affordability. I think, Corinne, you mentioned equity, affordability, but I think there's also that livability and community aspect that go with, having a vibrant, successful community. And I think, it's good to Ed to point out the livability aspects, the amenity, the infrastructure, and then also I think having diverse communities through ensuring that we don't have, if you like, income lines, where people can purchase. I think that's really important in terms of having diverse, vibrant communities. So in terms of the maybe just picking up on some of the initial initiatives, which I think will play into that increasing supply of new subsidised housing, which I think is important going forward. As other people have pointed out, the overall supply of whether it's public housing, social housing, affordable housing, the numbers have continued to decrease as a proportion of our population. nationally. So the ACT is not alone in terms of, I guess, struggling to generate sufficient supply going forward. And I should say there's a role for government, I think, in terms of not just facilitating the release of land and providing subsidy, but I also think, there's a role for government in terms of the provision of certain types of subsidised housing, particularly for people that need additional support with wraparound services. And I think there's a clear role for government, in my view, to provide those properties on an ongoing basis. And I think, so I don't sort of see community housing providers as an alternative as to the role of government. I sort of see it as complementary. And I think that's important in terms of moving forward as well, that, we can all sort of work together and complement what each other are doing in terms of servicing the various cohorts to ensure that Canberra is an affordable place to live, not just for those with an income or those with a higher income, but for those that basically have no market income and rely on welfare, and those that are basically, working poor. Because I think all of these groups are in need of assistance, and some sort of strategy that covers the housing continuum is really important. Just to pick up on maybe the LVC side of things. So, I'm interested obviously in the long-term future. Probably the next 5 years is my immediate focus, and it's good to note that the government has, I guess, an ambitious target in terms of overall supply numbers, but then in particular for the subsidised housing, where we're looking at 5,000 over the next 5 years. And certainly from a CHC perspective, we're looking to step up in a substantial way as an organisation. Part of that has been opportunistic, so tapping into existing, whether it's a ACT or Commonwealth funding rounds, because that is one factor that can unlock new supply of social and affordable housing. The other sort of factor for us is also when we're undertaking our own developments, that model that I referred to that CHC has used for the last 25 years. So in some cases, so you can control your own destiny, I guess, in terms of development pipeline. You're not waiting for the next funding round. And I think the recent changes that the government have made on LVC and TPP, the territory priority projects, are important steps in a direction of actually unlocking that supply as well. So the LVC changes, where there's a possibility to, reduce LVC charges for developments at a CHP is undertaking, I think, is an important change. And then also the ability to potentially qualify for TPP is also an important change, because as we know, some CHPs have been hit quite hard when it comes to actually undertaking zoning changes, and the holding costs and the delays and so forth, for a CHP are quite substantial. We don't have deep pockets like developers. So I guess I'm feeling quite optimistic that there's an ability for us to really make a head start in terms of making some inroads into those overall targets and setting us up for beyond through those changes. So I just want to say, I think from an LVC point of view, certainly government has given relief for LVC in the past, but having that sort of framework and certainty when we assess the feasibility of new projects, having that certainty makes it very transparent and clear upfront in terms of how we can make that project work. And I think, this whole notion, particularly for subsidised housing, where, the government will take in one hand and give back in the other, is, in my view, inefficient. So the ability to sort of avoid that LVC, use that sort of concession to then increase the amount of, say, long-term affordable rentals that we can retain, I think that's a very smart and efficient thing to do. As I say, just to finish on the last point, Corinne, so there's plenty of time for questions. I think access to land remains one of the most important aspects. So whether it's through the missing middle or whether it's through, for example, having access, for example, to auctions of land, say from the SLA when they come up, Again, it's good to see that there's initiative there where they've identified 2 blocks of land that I'm aware of for CHPs to bid in on. But obviously, if we want to see the sort of numbers, it'd be good to sort of scale that and embed that moving forward. Because as I say, if you're a CHP and you're looking to deliver a sub-market product, the price that you can pay to make that particular project viable is going to be substantially less and different to what you see if it was purely market. I'll finish there. Thanks, Corinne.
Thanks very much, Nathan. Now, let's open it up to questions. I can see that we don't have any questions yet, but if people want to put their hand up, maybe I'll just go to one of the points that you mentioned, Nathan, which was around, and we've obviously had that discussion around LVC. We've had quite a bit of time talking about that, but it is something that we are also grappling with in terms of our position in relation to the remission that's been proposed, or that the government have announced for social and affordable housing. So I take it from what you're saying is that you see that as a positive step, and that, because what we're currently trying to grapple with is we recognise there's that feasibility and that financing issue for community housing providers. Is that the best way to address that through remitting the LVC, or should we be looking at other mechanisms?
Look, I don't think it's a one size fits all. So I would argue, and I should say too, to echo Tim's point, like I have no issue with LVC as a concept. Where you're capturing value uplift for the benefit of taxpayers. Like, I think no issue at all. I think the issue for me is, so where we can get access to land, paying LVC obviously just detracts from what we can deliver, and it just means that with my other hand, I have to go and ask government for a subsidy to effect if I want to still deliver the same amount of subsidised properties. If I need to, for example, buy, I think that's more efficient. For example, when I'm seeking to buy, say, government land and I get the LVC waived, if I'm basically buying land off or buying properties off a private developer where LVC has been applied, and I still have to go to the government and ask for a subsidy, then in my view, basically it's cheaper and more efficient if I can basically go and access land and not pay LVC and not pay developer margin in terms of buying or in terms of undertaking the development myself. So do I think it's enough? No. Do I think there's still a need for some form of ongoing subsidy, like an availability payment or potentially an upfront capital payment? Yes, it needs to be sort of, if we want to see the sort of scale and growth, it does need to be supplemented by other initiatives.
And are there other things that you can see that could potentially be done? Obviously, we need to be looking at increasing it, as you say, we need to be increasing the full spectrum of social and affordable housing. That includes public, community housing and social housing and affordable housing. But are there other ways, if we're looking specifically at missing middle, are there particular policy levers or mechanisms that we should be recommending to the government so that we can ensure that some of that is social and affordable housing? Are there particular mechanisms we can use to do that? Because it's sort of a little bit different when we look at greenfield development or other types of development where we might be able to look at, requirements for developers to have a certain amount that's allocated to that. But are there other particular type of mechanisms that we could use to try and increase the supply of social and affordable housing in that way?
Look, I think there are mechanisms, and as I was saying before, I think while we would have the ability to purchase land the same as private participants, it would be difficult for a CHP to compete, given that what we offer is essentially a sub-market product. So there would need to be some consideration given to how do you ensure that there's a portion of, say, social and affordable that gets released or unlocked as a consequence of this infill. Now I guess there's a range of different options that you could consider in that space. Not wanting to sort of trigger the strata sort of conversation, but I completely understand the concerns and the issues. But to me, the New South Wales, the uplift in terms of, for example, floor space, and then having that requirement, that's something that, do you get bonuses, for example, when you're looking at what you can do on a particular site, subject to the constraints, if you were to offer it or offer a portion of it for social and affordable. It's looking at something like that. If they're going to be collecting LVC or other charges, for example, on these infill developments, is there an opportunity to hypothecate some of that additional revenue for the purposes of investing in social and affordable? So, for example, the City of Sydney have a charge which basically applies to new developments, which then basically is hypothecated to a CHP in Sydney to undertake investments in social and affordable housing. There's a spectrum of options there, and they're just two that come to mind. But whether they're the best for the ACT, I guess that would, that's contestable.
Treasury often don't like hypothecation when it comes to taxes and charges, but certainly, I mean, at the moment, the lease variation charge just goes back into consolidated revenue. So, yeah, yes. Well, I haven't managed time very well because we only have 15 minutes to pull back into a panel discussion. Does anyone, just before we do that, does anyone have any final questions for Nathan? I don't think we've had any in the chat. Well, in which case, thank you very much, Nathan. I might now just bring us back to the broader group. And we know that we did have a number of questions that people have asked during the discussion. So we don't have a lot of time. We'll see what we can get back to. But I might just start off by asking a question that has so as has been mentioned previously, the inquiry is underway in the ACT. We've had the hearings this week, and one of the questions that we were asked at the hearings, and I know has been discussed, is around what the actual relationship is between these planning reforms and supply and affordability. And a particular question that was asked to us was around filtering, and which is for those who aren't aware of that argument, the idea that as new homes are built, older homes will become more affordable as higher income households move into new stock. And so essentially, by increasing the supply of housing through missing middle housing, that will have overall the effect of improving affordability. I just wanted to throw it over to the panel to see if they had any views around this. I don't know if maybe that might be one, Tim, if you wanted to. I was kind of looking towards you, Tim. I thought that sort of sits with you. Yeah.
Really happy to comment. You summarised the basic principle very nicely, and so whoever you were listening to on the inquiry who summarised the basic principle did a good job. It's a strange thing that it become this word and this concept continue getting raised. It's actually sort of completely obvious from an economic perspective that when more of any good is produced in a market, even if the goods are of different types, it tends to push down the price of all types in the markets. When somebody buys a new car and sells an old car, we expect, the new car does contribute to the car stock, and it works just the same way for housing. But somehow it's become, I'm not sure who continues raising this as if it's somehow highly determinative of policy outcomes. Somehow it's certainly when new housing gets built, it's at a high price point because it's usually built to a higher standard than a lot of older housing, like for size and location, obviously. But of course, that is still additional housing stock. And I think the best way to think about housing affordability, this is the way I explain it, is that if you like, the stock of people and all their dollars and their preferences is competing with the stock of housing. and all its locations, and there's a great big mash-up where everybody's pitching what they can to rent or buy this particular house or that particular house, and the rental price sort of emerges as the price that matches the stock to the people. Now, naturally, in that process, the best locations and the highest quality housing goes to people with the highest income. But if such housing is built, if new missing middle housing unlocked by these reforms is luxury townhouses, luxury apartments, this is perfectly good from the point of view of increasing the housing stock if that happens. I suppose the really key point here is that from a government point of view, the right policy approach to achieving your policy goals depends on those goals. And when it comes to housing affordability, the concern is always for people that struggle to afford housing. And rezoning to enable more market rate housing to be built and therefore filter, or you could say trickle down to those at the bottom of the income distribution, is a very indirect way of solving your problem compared to just building houses or supplying money to community housing organisations such as Nathan, or tax breaks to such organisations. So simply from the point of view of solving the acute end of housing unaffordability, clearly don't think about zoning. It's social and affordable and community housing that's the right way in. I suppose that's a really obvious point, that the people bring to housing markets the dollars they have, and the markets just distribute housing according to your willingness to pay, which is to say your ability to pay. And if we want housing to go to those on the bottom, it's going to have to be a government, state or territory government responsibility to do that directly to counteract these effects of the market through organisations like Nathan's. But the filtering point is simply to say all new housing is good. Is good housing from the point of view of affordability, but directing policy efforts, and especially expensive policy concessions at the right end of the market, is a smart thing for a government that really wants to maximise the bang for buck. And I made an aside comment in my earlier remarks, and I might just repeat it. I think it's important for people working and advocating in this area, which is that when you issue concessions that skew land purchases away from a private developer who might supply market rate apartments, luxury apartments, and they skew it towards Nathan's organisations, which can outbid them, you're skewing in a way quality, well-located land and construction resources. Those get skewed towards a housing provider that's going to look after people at the bottom of the income distribution. Now, that's good policy to skew ownership in that way if you're trying to look after the people on the bottom. Just in the same way that, say, first home buyer tax concessions and tax breaks tend to, if you like, unlevel the playing field or level it, depending which way you look, compared to existing owners who may have built wealth. In just the same way, unleveling the playing field to give community housing organisations a leg up, or to social and affordable housing providers a leg up in that land purchase, may be a really smart way of achieving the policy goal. But if you're trying to use tax breaks to get more housing built per se, rather than to just redistribute who ends up building it, if you're trying to do that, you're probably going to fail. These tax breaks are only going to be factored into the price of land, and it's going to fail because the market or land development has a pace at which it wants to bring market rate housing to market. It's a pace at which it wants to develop land, and you really can't overcome that pace with subsidies. All you'll end up doing is lining the pockets of landowners. So I think it's a really key point, that when I know the ACT government's spoken about missing middle LVC concessions and also social and affordable housing LVC concessions. I see the first one as probably a low value use of money, I would say, if you're trying to make housing cheaper, and the second one as a really probably high value use of money. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Corinne, for the question.
Kathy, you've got your hand up. Do you want to make a point?
Just a quick, sorry, I'll attempt to put my hand down at the same time as I'm speaking. A quick sort of, I think really important about the point about supply, which is really relevant to apartments. I'm not an economist, but even I can work out that supply has no meaning without reference to demand. So the two things go hand in hand. And of course, Ed mentioned this, the appalling tax policies we have that incentivise people, Ed and my age, to bid against our own children and outbid them. I get a tax break for doing so. I already own a house. If I bid against my own children, these tax policies are absolutely mad, and they profoundly affect the apartment market more than anything else, because the apartment market offers investors widgets that just all look the same. Almost all apartments are built speculatively for the investor market. And the result is that, I mean, I was writing with Hazel East Hope yesterday, and I mean, Hazel's latest figure on the number of owner occupiers in apartments is horrifying. It's actually under 30%. So there's no point, and this is not affordable housing in the sense of what Shelter's concerned with, which is community housing, except that I will say I think Australian governments are very dishonest every time they utter those words, affordable housing, because I think most Australians don't know that has a technical meaning. They think affordable housing means housing that people could afford to buy. But if the housing you are attempting to supply has a artificially inflated demand because it's being bought by people who already own a home, then, you know, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And certainly the theory that if we incentivise investors, and also there's a big foreign investment piece in this in some markets because of FIRB approval for new builds, the idea that, will that get to more housing? I mean, you know, again, economists can speak to more than this, but I've been watching this happen for over 20 years now, and it doesn't appear to have got us affordable housing.
Yes, certainly. I think we certainly need to be looking, and there has been a very almost singular approach from governments looking at supply, but we need to be looking at both sides of the equation, both demand and supply, and part of that demand piece is very much some of the tax settings, as has been mentioned. So look, we are, gosh, I haven't done a great job timekeeping, I think, here. We don't have much time left. Is there any final thoughts from the panel members that they want to bring to the discussion, or particular things that they think need to be prioritised? I might just start with you, Ed, if there's anything that you wanted to mention, or something that you didn't quite get round to talking about in your discussion, but just keep it brief if you can.
No, I love Kathy's presentation. Thanks, Kathy. I think you hit the nail on the head with strata title stuff. Thanks. And Tim as well. I like Tim's presentation. I got nothing further to add. Thank you.
It's all been covered. Well, I kind of feel like we've just there's still actually quite a lot. I can see that there's quite a lot of discussion in the chat. And it has been quite a complex and multi-dimensional area of policy, and one which I think that we're still continuing to grapple with some of the elements and what the best approaches are. Did any of the other speakers just want to have any final points?
Corinne, I might just come back to a few elements. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we have quite a few representatives from different government agencies on the call, and I'm sure for all of us it's been a really great experience to hear the different views. We're aware of a lot of these issues, and in some areas with our sort of housing and strata policy we're doing well. In other areas there's clearly work that we need to do to keep making sure that the system is delivering outcomes for the community that we serve. So I really appreciate that discussion today, and have made some good connections for further conversations to keep trying to understand these issues and what options we have to keep on improving the planning system, but also all of those things around the planning system that just are integral to how people live and operate and move around the city, and making sure that the rules and regulations we have support people rather than cause grief and add burden to their lives. So that's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I kind of feel each of the topics and there's been some depth and intricacy in them, and they are so important. I feel like we could have had had a webinar on just each one of those, and I think a challenge today has been traversing all the different things we've covered. But I really hope, I've certainly found it incredibly useful and insightful, and thank you so much to all of the speakers for the expertise and insights that you've brought to the discussion today, and thank you also to everyone who's joined us. It's been great to have that level of engagement. It's clearly a discussion that we are going to continue to have. And we'll certainly hope to pick up some of the issues we've talked about today in some of the work that we're doing. Look, just before we do wind up, if you're not already on our newsletter and events mailing list, we'd love you to stay connected. We are hoping to have some more webinars and events this year. I think Deb has popped the link to our newsletter and our events mailing list into the chat. So if you're not already signed up to that, I encourage you to do so. But look, we are rapidly approaching 3:30 and it is a Friday afternoon and we're near the weekend, so I don't want to go over time, but thank you again everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a relaxing weekend. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Corinne. You too.
Thanks. Thanks, Corinne.